Hello, and welcome to the Artificial Podcast, with your host Nick Myers.
Artificial
intelligence,
voice recognition, machine learning,
robotics,
actionable analytics.
It is Nick's goal to help everyone understand how AI and voice technology are reshaping our lives both personally and within organizations. Your glimpse into the growing world of AI and voice first starts now.
Nick Myers.
Nick Myers. Nick Myers.
Nick Myers.
Welcome to the Artificial Podcast. My name is Nick Myers, and I am here to help break down topics in artificial intelligence and voice first to show everyone how these technologies are going to impact our lives both personally and within organizations. The Artificial Podcast is brought to you by Red Fox AI, helping give brands a voice to the power of AI and voice assistant technology. Hey there, artificial podcasters. Welcome back to another episode and another week of the Artificial Podcast. My name is Nick Myers, and this week my guest on the Artificial Podcast is Tim Kobe. And let me tell you, I had the amazing pleasure of getting to see Tim speak at the Asia Real Estate Property Summit in Thailand back in November and get to meet him personally. And after learning a bit more about Tim and the work that he has done and the work that his firm 8 Inc. has done, I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to chat with him here and bring him on the show to share his insight of all the different things that he's worked on with everybody. But before Tim and I start talking, let me tell you a bit about Mr. Tim Kobe. Tim is a design leader, author, and founder of the globally recognized strategic and experience design firm 8 Inc. For over 30 years in design and a leader in innovation and branded experience, 8 Inc. has worked with companies such as Apple, Virgin Atlantic Airways, Nike, Lincoln, and Citibank. The firm takes an interdisciplinary and holistic approach, working across traditional disciplines and strategy, architecture, exhibition, interior design, product, communications, and branding. Tim has been featured and recognized for his work in prominent publications like Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg, The Economist, Dezeen, and Fast Company. His most recent book, Return on Experience, published by ORO Editions, will be released this year. Tim, welcome to the Artificial Podcast. How are you?
Very good, Nick. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Yeah, I've been so excited and looking forward to being able to interview you for the podcast, because I just think back to the talk that you gave at the Asia Real Estate Property Summit in Thailand, and I was just sitting there, I think, the entire time with my mouth open because it just resonated so much with me, and looking around the room with so many other people as well, and just the breadth of the different work you've been able to do and the experiences you've had doing that work is just amazing. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with you here and, of course, having you on the show.
Fantastic. Thanks.
So I think to kick things off here, I always like to, of course, get to know the guests a bit more and let the listeners kind of learn more about your background. So what led you to start your career in design and ultimately found 8 Inc.?
So I graduated from one of the top design schools in the U.S., Art Center College of Design, which is based in Pasadena. Growing up, always having an interest in design, having, I suppose, inspirational combination of parents. One, my mother has been an artist and art teacher her entire life, and my father has been a very practical sort of technician with skills in all sorts of areas of making things. So I suppose you put the two together and you end up with a designer as a son.
That's fantastic. So I know, of course, as I've learned more about you, and you and I have had a conversation prior to this, and can you explain, and this is super fascinating, can you explain why 8 Inc. is referred to as Apple's best kept secret, specifically what project led to that designation?
Well, we've been working with Apple for I think this 22 or 23 years. We were hired by Steve when he came back to the company, and we basically worked with him every week that he was there. And one of the key things, I suppose, was while we were hired initially to help launch the products and create the events for Apple, I submitted to Steve a white paper on why Apple should do their own retail. And so we were hired to begin the retail program with him on a whiteboard. And so basically we helped to shape and develop the retail program over those many years. And in meeting with him every week, obviously getting to really deeply understand the brand, the values of Apple, which we knew very well, but really coming from Steve, who has really created the values. But our work with them has continued beyond his passing, and so we stay actively involved in a number of different client relationships like Apple. And I'm currently based in Singapore and New York, so I tend to commute a bit back and forth. But we support clients similarly to Apple in different parts of the world, depending on the studio.
Wow, that's incredible. So, given you were able to work on a project like that with Apple, and of course, seeing, I'm sure, from the first iteration of that to the Apple Store today, has the Apple Store itself, as things evolved, has it pretty much still held those same design components that you guys set out to do initially, or have things evolved a different way over the past few years? Does it still hold true to that vision you have?
Well, I think the key part to make the Apple Retail program successful was to reflect to people, through a physical touch point,
Mm-hmm.
the values that Apple stood for. And ideas of accessible technology has always been at the root of the company, but making it accessible in every way, through the experience that people have with Apple, it has to be reflected in the products and services. It has to be reflected in the communications and staff behavior, and certainly the environments that you encounter the company through. And so the idea that those values really haven't changed.
Yeah.
The expression of those touch points have evolved. We completed the first year of stores, and the first thing we did after the initial year was Steve said, "Okay, now everybody's copying us on that. Let's do the next generation." And so he knew that the competition would immediately go and try to emulate what Apple was. So he immediately started on the second version, and so we then started working on how we would evolve that, and ultimately brought in the metal and the glass elements and all of the components that you see today. Those materials have evolved, and I guess they're on the fifth or sixth vintage of the store program currently. But we worked on essentially defining the first four up until Steve's passing. When he left the company, I went to Singapore, so I no longer engaged in the retail program, and Johnny took over the design role for it, and that's evolved obviously with Foster's office and others.
Wow, what an incredible project! I mean, I can't even imagine being able to work directly with somebody like Steve on something like that is so customer facing. And when you think of Apple these days, I don't know if maybe other people like this, but for me, I just envision the store. I envision the storefront. I envision the huge glass doors. I envision walking in, and it's just that big open air space, and all the tech products are lined up. I mean, wow, that's incredible. And I know, of course, aside from Apple, you've been able to work on some really neat projects as well for some other major companies. So what has been one of your most exciting projects to date, maybe beyond just Apple here, that now when you look back upon, you think to yourself, we really did something amazing there?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the different things that we're involved in, the ones that to me are the most interesting, or the most maybe ones to admire, would be the ones that have the greatest impact. And I think that part of design's responsibility is to create value. That value isn't necessarily money, but the value is to use design to help define human progress. And I think that when we look at projects of any type, we look at the opportunity to have large scale impact, and the ability to help improve whatever conditions we have today into better ones tomorrow. So, I think that one of the reasons that we've been involved in technology is I think we really understand technology in a slightly different way. Part of that comes from obviously working with Steve for such a long time. But I think that, in working with many other technology companies, we understand where there's a lot of breakdown in the value creation chain when it comes to people misunderstanding the difference between a technical capability and creating technology. And to me, that idea of uh, recognizing that it has to have an application for people that matters to people for it to be
Yeah.
successful is really at the heart of any technical progress that we're making.
Yeah, and I know you and I in our last discussion talked about how the focus more than ever now with some of these new pieces of emerging tech, and we'll talk about this in a bit here, but is really honing in on that human outcome. And whatever you design has to focus on the human outcome associated with that, because you look at products like what Apple has made over the years, and they all do that. And really, the most successful products, the most successful experiences. I'm even thinking back to the Nissan one that you showed in Thailand. That was all focused on the person and the human outcome. So I think there needs to be so much more of an emphasis placed on that more now than ever with some of these different pieces of emerging tech. So it's really exciting to see that that's a core part of 8 Inc. and your design philosophy overall. So given your experience working directly with Steve, and you're definitely probably the only person I can ever ask this question to, but given your experience working directly with Steve Jobs, what do you think, if he were alive today, what he would say about today's current tech climate and where it is heading?
Well, I think it's easy to say that he was probably an outlier to
Yeah.
to the community. He was extremely loved in some cases for being like that, and he was also disliked for being like that. And I think what he was doing was really championing the outcome
Yeah.
that people have with technology, and that's different than looking again at that capability. And so a lot of technology had been created historically, prior to Apple and Steve's influence on this, much more in an engineer focus. And I think he brought the user experience to the forefront and ensured that he was fighting for that. And in many ways, where there was opportunities for the industry to create a kind of protected environment for it, he was interested in breaking down those barriers and being able to make technology accessible to everyone. And I think that he would probably look at the current state of technical capability and look to extract value by defining what we do, to focus on purpose and to focus on what it does for people. I think today we tend to get lost in the technical capability all the time. Our artificial intelligence is a great example because here is a technical capability really looking for a purpose, and
Yes.
so people are running around trying to commercialize it, which has been the normal process with technical capability. I think Steve would look at it differently, and I know that the solution he would have would be something that would separate that point of view from the majority of the point of view, which is very familiar and very, very similar. And that when you create parity in technology, you essentially commoditize what you have. And what happens today is a lot of people in rushing to manufacture something commoditize what they offer, and you end up with technology just not having that much influence. The idea that anyone is interested in iPhone 21 or Samsung 43 or Huawei 55 is it's absurd, right?
Yeah.
And it's absurd because people are looking at the next technical capability, adding a megapixel or
Yeah.
better battery life or whatever it may be. But that's no different than the consumption society that the automotive industry used or that other industries have used over time, where you're just doing these incremental improvements and selling more stuff. And I think that it works for a while, but it's a declining path to success, and you need people like Steve. I think it's an enormous loss that we don't have him here today, because he's one of those people who knew how to create value, knew how to understand what the focus and priority should be, so that what you're creating actually can have impact and make progress.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. And the example you brought up where, AI is one of those technologies specifically right now where it's how much farther can we push the technical envelope of that as opposed to, all right, what is the purpose of this though? What are we actually doing with it? What problem is it solving? How is it actually helping improve someone's life? I would agree with you. I think that's a bit lost right now. And I'm really hopeful that, again, with people like you who are really trying to put more emphasis on the design aspect of some of these technologies, and I'm sure others around the world, that hopefully progress gets made there, because I think it's needed in order for this to really be successful. Which kind of leads me to my next question is, how much of a role do you think design should play in emerging technology like AI, voice, IoT, all of it that's really just starting to come to the forefront here? And do you think there's currently enough focus being placed on the design aspect with some of these emerging pieces of tech?
Well, I think design plays an equal role to any engineering. That technology is the application of a capability. You can't have just a capability, and you can't have just an application, without the technical capabilities. So it's very hard, in my mind, to separate those two if what you're trying to do is create value. If you're looking at an academic experiment, that's different. But if you're looking at it having impact in people's lives, then you have to start thinking about a much broader set of factors when you consider creating that. And if you're looking to actually create value, you have to use design as a tool to help you look at things in new ways. One of the big problems that we have with much of the technical development is with originality. If you look at even AI development, most machine language is a referential type of thing. It's precedent in some form in order to derive an outcome. But the problem is when you're looking at things that already exist, and that's your only frame of reference, you're only going to work from things that have been in some form rather than a new form. And I think, half of everything is the past, the other half is the future. We tend to not look at the future in the same way. We look at it as an evolution of the past rather than sort of the blue ocean strategy of going out and defining new things.
Yeah.
And I think that's where enormous value has been created historically. And I think that's also where the best, the best outcomes, for society happen.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think as we look at technical capability, I would imagine maybe at some point, of course we can keep pushing the envelope there, but at some point it's just going to, I think, get to a point where we can keep pushing the technical capability, but unless there is an aspect of there that actually, like you keep saying, creates value, then I don't think people are going to rush to it maybe as quickly as some would like to think, because, the whole reason we create technology and these different tools is to make our lives better. So I think, design more than anything, especially with the technology. I know you and I have talked about voice specifically. That needs to be at the forefront of everything with that piece of tech, because it is so consumer facing. Well, not even just consumer facing, it's going to be ubiquitous in everything. So I think design really needs to be at the forefront of every single aspect of some of these pieces of technology. And then with that, what do you think the most important principle or aspect of design that you think needs to be upheld as we develop and continue to expand the footprint of some of these emerging technologies, maybe focusing on AI voice or something like that?
Well, if you look, I think Andrew Ng at Stanford said that artificial intelligence is the next electricity. That's a pretty exciting thing to imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's going to enable a number of applications. But with the technology, it's what are the outcomes that come from that? What are the opportunities? Which things benefit the most people? Are usually the ones that create the highest value. So what it means is there's a predictable race in terms of where you can commercialize those things. But I think the exploration in terms of impact that artificial intelligence can have, much of the opportunity for that we clearly don't understand. I don't think that when electricity was was first utilized that they were predicting that it would be used in an iPhone. So
Right.
I think that the types of things that can come from this, to me are vast. The opportunity is really exciting and stimulating. The idea of how we think about it then becomes a question. And we have something called a value creation engine, which is a structure essentially that looks at the human outcome first in every case on any project. From the human outcome is where you create the most value. From that, you have to form a strategy, and the strategy has to deliver on those outcomes. And from the strategy, then you define the tactics that deliver on the strategy, which then deliver on the outcomes. So that structure is the inverse of the way much of the industry works. The industry works on the tactic first and then looks for an outcome. And what I think is important is that the iPhone was made up of a whole bunch of different technologies. Those things came together to produce human outcome, and it wasn't necessarily a single thing that made it work. The thing that made the iPod work was not just a single thing, but it was the experience that people had with the product as the starting point, and then the technical tactics that help deliver that. Those are the types of products that I think are going to emerge and probably have the most revolutionary type of impact on
And with that in mind, do you think there's any reason why maybe it almost seems like recently here more of an emphasis has been placed more on the technical capability versus the design aspect? Is there anything that you can think of or that stands out as to why that seems to be where tech is shifting, as opposed to maybe, in the past where we look at something like Apple products where, for so long it was always focused on, well, at least, with the 90s with the new iMac and everything, and up through the 2000s with the iPhone and everything there. But do you think that if there's anything particular as to why we're focusing more on technical when it comes to these now versus the design portion of that?
Well, I think what we have is a situation where it's easier to think in linear ways, because that's in many ways how we're trained to think. And the human mind has both a logic, a rational and a irrational, or say a logical and an emotional side. That's what makes us human. But I think that it's the linear thinking continues to build a very kind of rational thought, and that the fact that design tends to make connections in things that is nonlinear is very difficult for a lot of people to understand. And so I think it's easier and more natural to think in a linear fashion to rationalize something. But I know from the experience with Steve is that people would say he was difficult to work with. He was difficult in the sense that if you were a linear thinker and you brought a very strong logical argument to him, he would go through the logic and either find a bust in it or say, okay, the logic is right. But then he would look at it next from an intuitive perspective. And if it didn't pass the intuitive perspective, he would send it back. And people who were really good at logic couldn't handle being rejected with an intuitive answer. People who were really good at intuitive things were equally pushed back if the logic was broken. So, in my mind, to be successful, you need that to be ambidextrous. You need to be able to think both right and left brain in terms of the types of things that you're creating, and it's typically not that easy. And I think the education system, and this is where designers, I think, have a role to play, because obviously people who excel in design tend to think about things differently. They tend to make associations that are comfortable both in logic or in emotion, and they understand how to deal with those types of stimulants. So I think the idea that where we are today is a product of much of the way we're taught to think is probably at the heart of the problem.
Yeah, I would completely agree, and I can even say from now being more involved specifically in voice over these last couple of years, meeting some developers who are absolutely amazing at what they do. But that's to your point of thinking linearly, there's a lot of questions of, well, why isn't anybody using my voice app? Or, I create this great thing that has all these different set paths, but oh my gosh, all these people are using it completely differently. And it's almost like a huge struggle, as opposed to thinking it from a different perspective, where this is something that Amazon has actually tried to come out with, called situational design, where instead of designing voice apps or voice experiences following linear paths, kind of like what we've been accustomed to with IVR and some different things over the last couple of decades, is just designing for situations. And I think there is a really solid aspect of design and divergent thinking that goes into that is very hard for a lot of people. It's even been hard for me to think like that in some ways, but when you do, so much opportunity just starts coming to the forefront of what you're building. So I agree with you completely that I think that linear thinking is a huge hurdle that hopefully more people start recognizing as something that can be overcome if you just start looking at something from a more intuitive standpoint. So maybe focusing a bit on voice specifically now, because I know that's something you and I have been talking about. So voice as an emerging technology is predicted to become, ubiquitous in almost every aspect of our daily lives. How do you view voice from a design perspective, and what should we be paying attention to, you think, as it integrates itself into more and more of our daily lives?
Well, I think that voice is probably the most natural way that we've learned to communicate, and keyboards are really pretty antiquated and
Yeah.
pretty primitive when you really think about it. I don't spend much time typing anymore, particularly on mobile devices, and I think that you tend to see interface development proceed in a way that's going to become the most natural and the easiest for people to use. So as the technology gets better, there's still a long way to go in terms of performance, because a lot of people are turned off by voice today because they may be talking to their bank bot and
Yeah.
realize that only about 10% of the information is actually registers. But I think that voice is the most natural interface. Voice and gesture are the two most common ways human beings interact, and I think that those naturally will evolve because that's the way people are, and the technology that will be best serving people will be the technology that enables them to engage in the easiest possible way.
Yeah, because I remember you saying when we talked last how ridiculous it is that we still type in these mini keyboards on all of our smartphones, which when you think about it, I guess at this point in time is pretty antiquated in so many ways. And I catch myself as well doing simple things like that on my smartphone. Of course, using iPhone, I have Siri do a lot of those functionalities, but a lot of people I know who own Android devices use Google Assistant more than I actually originally assumed that they would, to do just what you said, send messages, do all this basic stuff that we really shouldn't probably be doing manually as much anymore, given the scope of how technology has evolved. So I'm really interested as well to kind of see how design takes more of a center stage to voice, because I agree with you. It truly is, I think, one of the most natural interfaces, and maybe be one of the last interfaces that we have with technology. I don't know. Do you think it could potentially be the last interface, or do you think something else is on the horizon?
Well, I think where we're going you can't think of the tech outside of the human being interface.
Yeah.
So there's two sides to the interface. To me, we still have ears and mouths and eyes,
Yeah.
and these are our sensors that we're built with. Until they're not, I suppose, that that relationship will still need to interface in the most natural ways that we have to understand information. I think the forms, that there's the method, and then there's the different forms that it can take. But if you think about the access to information. If we have our mobile devices currently accessing information, you combine that with artificial intelligence, the notion that you can have contextualized
Mm-hmm.
knowledge as opposed to information is far more valuable. And the ability to get contextualized knowledge means the types of processing, the types of questioning, the sensors that we have the ability to be persistent. The idea that you can have the future of education essentially be in an earpiece that's persistently reminding you of the context you're in and the knowledge that you need to have to perform with that context. I think that's a really interesting area. This is the kind of thing that can disrupt universities, it can disrupt business operations, etc. And that's where I think that the ability for technology to work with people has to become an area of really deep exploration.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And there, when you really start getting out of the nitty gritty of the capabilities, when you start combining two different pieces of emerging tech like AI and voice, pairing those together and seeing really how it can fit in to some of these aspects of our daily lives that make things easier, to your point about just having an earpiece in, or, AirPods or Echo Buds or Google Pixel Buds kind of helping you with your daily life in terms of education. And say you're walking down the street and you're having turn by turn directions, which you can already kind of do with Google Assistant to a greater extent. Or you walk into a museum and all of a sudden it pings a sensor and now you get a full guided tour. I mean, there's so many different aspects of that I think are really going to propel that human aspect forward. So I'm really excited and agree with you completely that I think where things are headed in the long run. So given that, of course, you've founded and have grown 8 Inc. here over the last few decades, for anyone looking to start their own firm or jump into a startup specifically in an emerging tech space, what is one thing that you've personally learned over the years that you can share maybe as a key stepping stone to success as an entrepreneur or founder?
I suppose it's hard to make the general statements. I think the value creation engine that I mentioned before, the idea of human outcome to strategy to tactic, to me is the most powerful structure if you're looking to do a startup or create a company. The reason is the role of a company is to create value for people. So whatever that is, you're ideally in a much better position if you follow that structure than if you start with the tactics and try to find a use for it. I think also it's important to I guess to keep that focus throughout the development. You know, it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to have the next interesting thing that you read about, on the internet, influence what you're doing. But if you don't have your core purpose clear, the rest of it can confuse you and put you into a very, very challenging kind of situation. So, again, I think it's keeping the focus and that value creation structure as a kind of touch point. That if you're having a conversation about a particular thing, where does it fit in that structure? And if you're focusing on tactics before you've defined your strategy or your outcomes, then you should probably work back up the food chain a bit.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. And as of course I started building Red Fox and getting into what we were doing with AI and voice specifically, of course I read a lot of articles about a lot of different early stage companies and startups, and specifically the ones that didn't make it. And they all kind of followed that same trend that you just mentioned, where it seemed like they focused on the tactics to, I wouldn't say get rich quick, but they focused just so much on the product without what their purpose was in the marketplace and the people that they were trying to serve, and maintaining that throughout what they were building. So I completely agree. And I'm even going to just, noodle on the advice you just shared there a bit more, because I think even where I'm at, we're still solidifying what our purpose is and who we want to help. And I think for any early stage company or startup, that is essential to ensuring success. So I think that's absolutely fantastic advice. Now, of course, as we kind of wind things down here from this awesome discussion, Tim, I really appreciate all your insight and all this stuff. I'm just so excited sitting here. I always ask this question of every guest I have on the show because I love the different responses. But what is one thing that you think someone can do today to begin leveraging either some of these core principles of design that we've talked about, or just emerging technology in general, either personally or within their organization?
If I go back to some of the things that you hear as technology is evolving, one common thing I hear is the question of, is artificial intelligence a threat or an opportunity? And to me, it's both. But the idea that we tend to polarize the debate into it's either one or the other is a really unfortunate kind of simplification. There's certainly the fear of the rise of the machine. The idea of fear of the rise of the machine ultimately is a distraction that I think it's being used because as a society we tend to fear for our livelihood, or we fear for relevance, etc. What I think we should be very afraid of is how other people may be using this technology for their benefit and at the expense of society.
Right.
So I would be looking at understanding that the greatest risk will come from the development of artificial intelligence into a form that is not accessible to everyone. And that notion of accessibility and the openness of that technology, it goes back to what made Steve relevant and valuable to his generation of people. But I think it's fundamentally at the heart of any technological development. So I would be, these days suspicious of things that aren't focused on a broad application of human outcome relative to technology. We've seen it abused very easily once it gets in the wrong hands. So, to me, it's important to keep that framework and to keep it as open and accessible to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. I think that's an amazing answer to that question. And that's something I've actually been asked by quite a few people as I give my talks on AI and voices. Aren't you afraid of this siloing specific groups of people, as we've kind of seen in the past? And, I kind of reiterate some of what you said, where, as long as we keep the core focus on how it can help people and how it can empower people, I think the accessibility will hopefully remain, because these technologies have the capability to be accessed by everybody. I mean, just even thinking about how the internet is now being deployed in areas of the world where we never thought it could be deployed before, because of some of these different pieces of technology we can deploy to funnel it to them. I agree with you completely that accessibility should be the main focus, and whether you're deploying this within your organization or whether you're trying to use it personally, that always needs to be kept in mind, because the moment we lose sight of that is when we could really encounter some problems. So I think that is an excellent answer to that question. Well, Tim, this has been an amazing chat. I've learned so much, of course, just from being able to chat with you here on this episode. And if anybody wanted to reach out to you or get in touch with you, what are some of the best ways for them to go about doing so?
My email is kobe@8inc.com. So EIGHTINC.com. We have website 8inc.com. I'm happy to speak with people about technology. Obviously, it's something we've been doing all of our lives, but really happy to keep the conversation going within the broader community, because I think it's important for all of us to be speaking, thinking, and talking about this if we're going to end up with a positive outcome in the future.
Absolutely. I know I mentioned your book in your bio, but I don't know if you want to provide any quick deals about your book that is coming out this year as well.
It should be out mid-year. You can pre-order on Amazon.com. I think it's one of two. There's a second one that we're working on, but it's really the introduction to return on experience. The idea that if you design a proper experience for people, you can create value, and then what are those values that are created.
Fantastic. Well, Tim, thank you so much again for taking the time to chat with me here. It's been an excellent conversation, and I'm really looking forward to keep in touch and collaborating in the future with you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Artificial
Intelligence.
voice recognition, machine learning.
Robotics.
You've been listening to the Artificial Podcast with your host, Nick Myers.
Nick Myers.
To stay up to date with all our latest episodes, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts. To learn more about how your organization can benefit by unlocking the power of AI and voice, visit www.redfox-ai.com. Until next time.